If you were to hear someone say they're going to make that story come to life, it's going to come alive, what kind of thought would go through your mind? Typically in our culture, the number one thought is they're going to make a movie about it. Not too many decades, maybe a generation or two ago, the main thought would have been they're going to write a book about it. We live in a culture that has ceased to be a literary culture and it has turned into a visual culture. And that's not really to our advantage. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul talks about letters that actually come alive, become a living message, as it were. And although that's not the only subject in the third chapter of 2 Corinthians, it's actually the beginning of that chapter. So the time we have together on this occasion, I'd like to talk about 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. I'd like to read through it, and then let's go back and talk about 6 different elements that are involved in that message becoming a living message. Here's what he writes. You are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read by all men. Clearly you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. And we have such trust through Christ toward God, and not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Interesting statements. Being a living letter, as it were. 6 items involved in verses 2 through 6. The first thing he mentions in verse number 2, you are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read by all men. In order for something to be read by all, known by all, understood by all, it's got to be something that's legible. Typically, we don't talk about writing letters anymore. We talk about sending emails. But just imagine that you received an email from a very close friend, and it wasn't written in the alphabet, it was written in symbols, without any kind of key that you could decipher it. What does that message say? You don't know. It cannot be read by everyone. It's not read by you. It cannot be understood or known by those around you. It's not understood by you. It's got to be legible. For that letter of Christ, that living message, to be something that's found within the heart of the Christian, it's got to be something that can be understood. It's got to be something that's legible. The second thing that he mentions in verse number 3, and actually verse 3 contains 3 of these items. Clearly, you are an epistle of Christ ministered by us. It's not just that the message, the lettering, needs to be clear, but it needs to bear the expression of the author. It needs to be obvious that it's not you actually trying to put words into somebody else's mouth. This is a message that bears the expression of the author. The way that things are described is the way that he would describe them. The subject matter is the subjects that he would find important. The encouraging words that would be shared with those to whom the message is focused would be words of encouragement that deal with situations you face in life. It would be something that's relatable. But what he says is not just the fact that it's a legible message, but that you are clearly the epistle of Christ. He is the author of it. The expression of Christ needs to be something that is seen in a visible way in your life. In the third place, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God. In the third place, it's known by its handwriting. Not written by human hands. It's not written just with ink. It's written with the Spirit, by the Spirit of the living God. It's his handwriting, not yours. His message, not yours. His expressions, not yours. But it should be something that's understandable in the way that you mirror the life of Christ in your life. He talks about the material. He talks about the fact that it's not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. In the fourth place, the message of Christ needs to be written on prepared material, something that actually works. That parchment is something that's pliable. It's not something that has become so calloused, so rough, that the message, the lettering, can't even be clearly made. If you ever picked up a piece of paper and used maybe a felt tip marker, and then as you were writing the letters, the sides of the letters started kind of feathering out. And if those letters are written very close together, the words just seem to run together. Wrong kind of parchment, wrong kind of paper to use for that particular medium of ink. Everything has to be in place. For us to be living epistles, for us to be living in such a way that Christ is seen in us, it's got to be a message that's understandable. It's got to be something that bears the expression of Jesus himself. It's something where it is his handwriting, not ours. It's his message, not something that's ours. It's something that's written on prepared material. Not a heart that's arrogant, not a heart that is selfish, not a heart that is hard-hearted. It's got to have a proper kind of humility to it. An awareness that God's word is what is important, not what we wish or what we desire. Another element that's involved, it's got to be something that doesn't have mistakes. In verse number 5, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. Ever had a message written on a piece of paper that had lines scratched out? And it's like, why didn't they actually, if they're going to make that many mistakes, get a brand new piece of paper and write legibly and make it where my eyes are not drawn to the mistakes automatically when I open up the envelope and take the page out and take a look at it? We need to have not just the expression of the writer, not just prepared material, but it needs to be something that is free of blots. The sufficiency that we have is God, not us. The message is his, not ours. If we try to change it, we're just making mistakes on the page. Verse number 6, the statement is made that we are ministers, Paul says, of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. We are individuals who are ministers of the new covenant. You think about all of these statements together, the signature at the bottom of that page needs to be Jesus the Christ. Not what I want, not what you want, not what we determine as being important, but what God says is important. That makes all the difference in the world. One of the characteristic things about those early Christians was a recognition by those that were antagonistic to the faith of Christianity, those who wanted to stamp it out, those who persecuted Christians, was the fact that these people had been with Jesus, spent time with Jesus. And that after that first generation, these individuals had been spending time with those that had been close to Jesus. And then as it continued, the principles of the gospel of Christ are things that have been infused with each successive generation. There's an interesting word that Peter uses in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. It's the only time you find this word ever used. It's a word that's translated example. But the true meaning of that Greek word doesn't come out just in the English word example. Here's the verse. For to this were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. The word for example is a word that means literally the headline of a copybook. And it pictured very literally the first line that the rabbis would write and that the students would copy over and over and over again, endeavoring to get their handwriting to look just like the teacher's. Remember back in elementary school, that perfect lettering at the top of the page on that funny lined paper that you had to write on. And it was your task to make your lettering look like the lettering at the top of the page. And to begin with, it didn't look like anything at all like the lettering at the top. What Peter says by using this word is that Jesus left us that perfect line of lettering. It's our task to copy it over and over and over again to eventually get rid of the mistakes to where our lettering begins to look more like his and less like the way that we started scribbling in the first part of that page. And the more that we practice, the more that we learn, the more that we apply, our handwriting starts to look more and more like his. And that's the whole point. That's the whole process. We want our expressions to be his expressions, our way of life to be the way that he would want us to live. The principles upon which our heart is based are not our own, they're his. You see his expressions coming through. You see his handwriting coming through. Ultimately, you see his signature upon your heart. It's not yours anymore. The way Paul ultimately expressed that was to a group of Christians living in the province of Galatia. And he words it this way in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I want his signature upon my heart, not my own. Interesting illustration in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. The Christian should always endeavor to be that living epistle that's legible, that bears the expression of the author, that's known and read by everyone, that is written with prepared material, written upon not by the hand of himself or herself or humanity, but the words of God and the signature of Jesus, very much found upon that heart. Tremendous passage. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.